examples, and Kenya is one, a very sad example, where the inability of a political system to deal with ethnic and population divides has brought crisis and death and destruction. Again, this is something where outsiders, I think, cannot help. This is something where the new African middle class needs to be strong about. Now, all these risks of failure are important, but I believe that none of them, and even all of them combined, are likely to turn around the present promising trend that I have tried to describe to you. Does the West, and this is my last question, have a role in all this? We used to think of Africa as the needy, those who need our help. Jeffrey Sachs is your most important and famous helper. He invented the Millennium Development Goals, and he convened a panel in the Brookings Institution 7 years ago, which was entirely white male. There was no African in there. And they wrote a wonderful report on everything that needed to be done for Africa. Please, ladies and gentlemen, this must stop. Africans are ready, able, and fully prepared to think for themselves. And Mr. Sachs has done a lot of good by bringing down inflation in Poland 20 years ago, and certainly elsewhere. But his ideas of big shifts again and big incentives here and there, I think, are not what Africa needs now. So we need to take a close look at the Millennium Goals, who may be correct as goals, but the ideology behind that we are there and we are responsible in order to implement them, I think needs to be taken with more than a pinch of salt. Let Africans do it. They can do it. And I keep telling, especially my French friends, but also my British friends, that they still have a very profound and sometimes unconscious way of looking at Africans as people we need to do things for. In America, you have that more from a philanthropic side. You have the bad conscience of the Protestants and of the Jews who want to improve the world. That is one of your great undercurrents here. But the motivation may be good, but please don't overdo it in the sense that you think for them. We must not think for them because it has terrible consequences, especially in the African leadership. If those white people think for me, why should I not sit back and wait until everything arrives? And I will then write a nice report how I use the money, and they will not care. I'm exaggerating, and perhaps this is simplistic now. It's for the sake of the argument. Development aid will decrease in importance. Investment and trade will increase in importance. And already today, what Africa is doing for itself is much more coming from investment, international hedge funds now bringing private equity into Africa in huge sums, than from aid. So let's think about all this, and each time you donate something, just give it another 20 seconds of thought. Is it helping more the NGO that you are giving the money to, or is it really arriving where you would like it to arrive? And will it help there, or will it distort ideas and perceptions? I have seen examples of very efficient Western help in Africa, especially when it's small scale and when it's very personal. And I have seen examples of huge abuse. So still, the West has a role that China cannot fulfill. China can build cheap roads and can build stadiums. China will bring cheap goods for the African markets. And as an African Minister of Finance once told me, we can learn from them because they have come out of poverty 10 years ago. You have come out of poverty 150 years ago. You have forgotten how one comes out of poverty. So let us work with the Chinese. It's not against you, it's just complementary. And I think this was a very wise statement because complementary, China may be on the economic side. But when it comes to the rule of law, human dignity, development of freedom and democracy, institution building, strong institutions are at the core of everything. and China is not a model, and every African knows it. So we do have a role. We may not have this, the same economic role that we used to have in Africa, but if we take a fresh look at that continent and respond to their needs where they are being articulated, and do not try to compete building roads, then I think we as the West have a role in Africa and with Africans. Thank you very much. Will you direct it? Or?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So the press doesn't report very much about the persecution of Christians in the countries in Africa. The seriousness is the church burnings, the massacres, the Christian slaves, which seems to be almost exclusively perpetrated by the Muslims. Can you address that across the continent and what your views of the future of that persecution might be?
Religious relations, or relations between religions, are mostly of a very peaceful kind on the continent. In most countries, you have an animist tradition that has then been superseded from the 19th century by European missionaries, and has also been superseded by by Arab traders, especially in the east of Africa, but also going through the desert and coming into the northern part of the Sahel. So you have these both religions, or main world religions, Christianism and Islam, superseded on indigenous African beliefs, which very often leads Africans to have a relation to religion that is holistic, I would say. It is not a contradiction for many Africans to switch from one church to the other during one's lifetime, even to switch from Islam to Christendom or backwards, and still, once it gets dark, to talk to the spirits. So this is a very common way of embracing religion in Africa. The more you believe in, maybe the safer you are in terms of your reassurance on life after death, and the better for your family in terms of being lucky rather than unlucky. So the basic African approach towards religion is very, very tolerant. Now, this clashes with the aggressive ways of promoting, especially let's say, Sunni Islam in a very small part of Africa, and mainly in Nigeria, and that's what you're referring to. We now have this illuminated sect of very violent Muslims in the north and center of Nigeria, which does not represent a mainstream, but which does present a major challenge to the Nigerian government, because that government is based on a very delicate balance between Christian and Muslim interests. The country is about half and half, the south being more Christian and the north having been Islamized from the desert being more Muslim. How they are going to deal with that, I do not know, but please don't believe that burning of churches is an Africa-wide phenomenon. It is not. I know of no other country than Nigeria, and that particular region of Nigeria, where this has taken place. And would it take place elsewhere? I think we would know it.
Next question.
Sorry?
Egypt is a great example.
Well, I was talking about sub-Saharan Africa now. Of course, the Copts are in a very difficult phase of their history right now, and they're very worried that in the future Egyptian system, their interests might be less well protected than they used to be under Mubarak. I agree with you.
Doug?
I found your speech very informative. Thank you very much. Sanctions. Zimbabwe and South Africa, in their history, have had a lot of sanctions involved. But it doesn't always seem to be easy to figure out whether they work. As an ambassador with many years' experience, what is your view of the sort of the sanctions questions here?
They sometimes work and they often don't work. I think what is being done right now in the case of Iran and Syria, where there is an embargo on buying crude oil, especially on Iran, that may have an impact. The impact of sanctions against Ian Smith's Rhodesia up to 1980 was very limited for two reasons. First, the South African apartheid government was quietly helping Ian Smith to survive. And second, the white Rhodesians were very imaginative, creative, and inventive in terms of getting around and producing things themselves or busting sanctions, a combination of all of these factors. So those sanctions, I think, did not bring down Ian Smith. It was more the cost of the guerrilla war, of the two guerrilla armies from Mugabe and Como, who caused too many casualties in the country. So it was a mixture of, let's say, general Western pressure, and of course Ian Smith was totally out of time. He stood for something that the West and the North and the rest of Africa had abandoned. He stood for colonialism, and you couldn't do that anymore in the late 70s. It was just out of time. So, but he was not probably not brought down by sanctions in particular. The sanctions against Mugabe and his people, they annoy them terribly, because Robert Mugabe cannot spend a month in London as he used to and have tea with the Queen. That is for him an extreme insult, because he believes that he has a divine right to do that. The sanction of not accepting your children at universities, as brought about by Australia for the ZANU-PF government, hurt them very much, because even children who were in the middle of their course had to leave Australia and could not finish it. So it was a kind of family punishment. You may question that, but it has hurt them without bringing about change in Zimbabwe. So you may say that the Western sanctions have been unsuccessful. I think you are right in saying so. That is why all ambassadors in Harare were trying to lobby their governments back home to call Mugabe's bluff and abandon these personal sanctions against the ZANU leadership, because then he could not say anymore that they were crippling his economy. They were not crippling his economy, they were just preventing him and 200 others from traveling and from visiting their bank accounts in Switzerland. So altogether, sanctions usually don't work, but in some very precise cases, I believe now in Iran, they may have an effect if you manage to target the lifeline of a country or of a ruling establishment. So not buying Iranian oil anymore for Italians, Greeks, Spaniards, all the southern Europeans, quite a sacrifice, but may have an impact. We'll see in the next weeks and months.
Could you tell us in general words which NGOs are helpful, which kind of NGOs are not? I know you don't want to be specific.
There's an interesting book by a Dutch journalist, Linda Coleman, I believe is her name. As a rule, the bigger they are and the more overheads they have, and the better paid their senior staff is, the more you should use your common sense. If you have a church initiative that is dealing with something where one or two people have been and where they know the local people, and if it's related to a particular hospital, and if some wonderful people whom you personally know are putting their energy into it, it usually is worth going for. I myself have my reservations about the big international NGOs. They very often look for the next